Good afternoon, Rajiv. Great to see you again.
Absolutely lovely to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking time and doing this. And today's episode is going to be a cracker because you are the first guest and the author of the book that we're going to talk about today of season three.
Oh, well,
I've got
thanks for
many
having
more
me
authors
over.
coming in, and you're starting it for us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me over.
Absolutely, right? So before we get started, let me quickly introduce you to the audience. People know you on LinkedIn. You have been there for long time and people have been reading your posts. I'm going to reveal the secret of how this book came into existence, if you allow me to do that here. This is
Absolutely.
not part of the conversation, but I'm going to definitely reveal this to the audience. Because I am the moderator of the show, I have the formal responsibility of formally introducing you. So let me do that. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, whichever part of the world you're going to be in when you listen to this conversation between me and Mainak. This is a fantastic day to have a great leader. I'm going to introduce him formally. We have with us Mainak Dhar, Vice President, Managing Director, India and South Asia, Kimberly-Clark. And when I connected with him, that was because of a couple of posts that he used to regularly put, and I was following that. And somebody was read about KC as an organization from good to great, Jim Collins' book, and one of the standing organizations of examples over the years. I thought I should definitely connect with Mainak, and Mainak, remember that's what I told in the first conversation.
Absolutely.
And today I have him on the show. Now I'm going to take a minute to read because Kafi here and I couldn't read all that. But what I loved is he's somebody who's built businesses, he's scaled organizations, and he believes in creating a smell of the place. And I love that phrase in his introduction on LinkedIn. He says leaders have to create a smell of the place. He has authored 20 books translated in many, many languages. Above all that, I'm going to be very, very careful and cautious while asking him certain questions because he's also a karate black belt. So I don't know if he can do it virtually. I'm going to be little go back and do that. First author of Leaders in Libraries Season 3. Lovely having you, Manal. Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks, Rajiv. Thanks.
Yeah. That was so humble of him. Itna bol diya, one simple thing, thanks and done. Let's get started.
सब आपने बोल दिया यार. What do I say?
Super. All right. We want to talk about the book that he has written, the latest one that has come on LinkedIn. All of you must have definitely seen it. You see it behind him, and I'm holding it in my hand. This is fantastic. So, let me reveal how this book came into existence. Our man has been coaching a lot of people over the years, and people have been throwing questions at him saying, how have you done all this over the years? Give us pearls of wisdom. And he kept spewing all those pearls of wisdom. And one fine day, a friend says, why don't you write it? Till then, our man has not thought of putting it on text. And then went on to just scribble something, which we call it formally as a post on LinkedIn. And that scribble picked up fire, became posts, people started following, and he started writing one after the other. And today, what we want to talk is a collection of all those fantastic posts that has come out in the form of a book. All of you should go to Amazon, pick it up. It's there on the top bestsellers list. And these are articulated by Mainak as answers to those questions in 100 words. Hence, the book is beautifully called Leadership in 100 Words. Lovely, Mainak. What a fantastic thought process.
No, thanks a lot. And I think, the 100 words, to be honest, part of it is hindsight and serendipity because, when I typed that first post, it came to 102, 103. I looked at the screen and saying, that's a weird number. Let me make it 100. And, then I just kind of stuck with the hashtag of leadership in 100 words. But I think the broader part of that is, I'm not a guy who loves, spouting wisdom or giving gyan. I don't read self-help books. I don't profess to know much. So my whole take is when somebody asks a question, I'm not going to expound and give them an encyclopedic version of all the truths in the world because I'm just another guy trying to figure it out. So I feel sometimes the best way of helping people is asking them to think of questions in different ways, maybe ask different questions from the ones they're asking, personal storytelling of, when I might have been in their shoes and how I thought about stuff. And to do that, the best is to keep it pithy, to keep it succinct, and so that it sticks in people's minds versus, overwhelming them with information and gyan. So that's kind of, I think, One was serendipity that it came to 100 words, and the second is just my belief that to make an impact, you don't have to overwhelm people as long as you're
Yeah,
actually engaging with them and sharing things that will actually resonate with them.
absolutely. And I can completely subscribe to this because when I was reading through the pages, I realized when you say succinct and simple, the responses of what you have written on the pages got printed is almost like a conversation that you have had. It is not a spoken English converted to a textual English. It is just normal talk, and it didn't have MBA jargons, didn't have great lofty words. It was simple from the experience that you have garnered over the years.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think part of what I also am trying to convey through the book is you don't learn only in corporate trainings or MBA classes. In fact, every example I've given of mentorship and what I've learned have been things completely outside my corporate career. So I've talked about my parents, my grandfather, my sensei, because
Yeah,
I think we learn from everything and we learn from everyone. There are mentors all around us. So that's the other thing which I'm trying to convey here is many people need mentoring, but they wait for the company to appoint a mentor. They're looking for a senior person with a fancy job title. I think learning is not an activity, it's a mindset. And if you're open to learning, you can learn from everyone. And over time, that can really shape you in many different ways.
absolutely. And I also love the narration of your grandfather and father who have been great mentors and inspiration for you. They've all been officers who
Absolutely.
have done great work. And I could relate to that because my father was also a civil servant. So I could relate when I read those pages that what great work they must have done
Yeah.
for the nation. So super lovely. So I'm rubbing my hands to create some heat to get started with the first question.
Sure.
And there goes the
Excellent.
first one to you, which is Manat, over the years of leadership, and you've worked across countries, across continents and geographies, and you've been somebody who must have been reading books. Though you just said that you're not a self-help book person, but I see a lovely book stand behind you. Tell us a little bit about how books played a role in your journey of leadership.
No, I think books have played an integral role in shaping me as a person, not just as a leader. So, as a kid, we used to move around a lot. I mean, like your father, my father was in government service. So, before I finished my
Transferable.
school, went through 8 different schools. I was born in Nagaland, lived in Sikkim, Kolkata, Delhi, lived in Canada for a few years, came back to Delhi. So, if you think of that time, late 70s, early 80s, you don't have the internet, you don't have video games. And some of my earliest childhood memories are of reading. So my grandparents were in Kolkata. We'd frequently visit them, the whole Rajdhani from Delhi to Kolkata. My earliest memories are I'd be on the top bunk curled up with a book. And, when we moved to Canada, cold, like minus 20, 30, I'll be sitting by the window curled up with a book. So I think that early grounding of, moving so often, in a way, books and my favorite authors became my best friends. They were my constant companions along with my family. So I was a huge Tolkien freak. I taught myself how to write in the Elven tongue. I was that mad and that much of a nerd. And Stephen King. So I used to just read. And I think that really developed in me something which I think has become part of who I am, which is a
Mhm.
love of storytelling. And I
Right.
think that's at the core of what I love about reading and writing. So even when I'm writing nonfiction, you mentioned about it seems conversational. It's what I really like doing is engaging with people by telling stories, whether it's
Mhm.
fiction or nonfiction. And I think in that sense, that early love of reading and books, I think has really shaped me as a person in many ways.
Lovely. I know you took me back the memory lane because my father used to be working in Guwahati and he would come down to our native place, which is deep down in a place called Trichy in Tamil Nadu. And we
Yeah.
would go to West Calcutta, pick up a train from there. It's 3 days, 2 nights journey with all those
Yeah.
roti and sabji packed by my mom and books and ludos and all that carried
Yeah,
along. And keep
absolutely.
the briefcase in between and play. Oh my God. And we would read books and finish it and exchange books. So
Absolutely.
I can so
Absolutely.
understand that that was such a lovely time. कुछ करने को था ही नहीं, कूद के जा नहीं सकते बाहर. You can't go to play, तो
Absolutely.
फिर 4 आने बैठ के पढ़ लो.
Absolutely. That was a whole different age, had its
Absolutely,
own beauty.
absolutely, super, super. Such a lovely one, and look at that. Look at that point that you made that books have been an integral part of you. And I want to ask a question which is not part of this, but I think is important and pertinent for me to do this here is how did the transition from a reader to an author?
I think it happened in maybe two stages. From a reader to a writer and a writer to an author. And I'll tell you about the difference between the two. So I loved reading, and I think I had an overactive imagination. So in grade 7, when we were in Canada, I had an imaginary friend who'd sit next to me in class and called Freddie, and I'd give attendance on his behalf. I'd write tests on his behalf. So I think my mom figured out that, I probably had too much imagination and not many constructive ways of channeling it. So she told me, why don't you write down stuff that's on your mind? So my first transition was from all the stuff going on in my mind to start putting it down on paper. And I say that's a transition to a writer because I wasn't writing for anybody. I was just writing for my own fun, for my own interest. So I still remember, God knows if it's still there, if somebody found it when they were mowing their lawn. So in Canada, I actually wrote a diary, a pretty thick diary, a fictional account of how the world ended. It was a combination of a meteor strike and an alien invasion. And I dug up our front yard and I buried it, hoping to mess with the minds of future archaeologists. So I thought, I just read about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I thought 1,000 years from now, somebody will find this and say, oh my God, we've discovered this amazing historical artifact about what happened in the past. So that was me. I loved making up stuff. And my first transition was just writing for the heck of it. I think my transition into writing for others happened. I remember, yeah, around that time, maybe a couple of years from that time, I read an interview by Stephen King where he said the moment anyone pays you a cent for your writing, you're an author. Because then you're not just a writer, you're writing for someone, you're providing value for someone through your writing. So I had some poems written which I had stuffed in my drawer at home. I realized quickly nobody's going to pay me money for my poetry. So I solved the next term's maths paper. So one side had math solutions, next side had poem. I Xeroxed it and I sold it to my classmates. I sold 25 copies at 50 cents a pop, came home to my mother and with my $12.50 and said, Ma, I've become a published author. And so that was, I think, my first transition of the joy of writing for someone, but also adding value to someone. Now, that was obviously as a kid, the value was, friends got math solutions and didn't need to stress in class, and I got my poems to people. But I think that really stuck in my mind that writing is for yourself. Being an author is when you're actually adding value to someone and what you're doing is valued. So then I published my first book when I was in college in Delhi University. And, I think that's kind of when I think I'd made that transition and said, look, this is a part of my life which I'd love to keep alive.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm sure Steven Spielberg or somebody must have dug that place and picked out because वैसे भी American movies are about saving the world and some meteor striking all this stuff. Who knows? They must have picked it up from your dug up book somewhere. Lovely. So I'm going to go to the first concept that you speak, and what you did beautifully in the book, which I loved, is you kind of broke into three themes. You called it leading others, leading through change, and leading yours. There was three segments. That kind of segmentation categorize things in my mind. Though they were flowy, it was still in three sets. So I could kind of relate to that, right? So I'm going to talk about leading others and three things that I really loved in that. First one, you talk about something called, I called it a three-angle challenge when I read it. That's a phrase that I used here is, I'm a new leader. I'm under pressure to get my team to perform and also have to engage them. I'm new, team has to perform and engage them. That's like quite a work on the plate.
Yeah.
What's your advice for the young people? How should they go about doing all these three stuff?
No, I think the first thing new leaders, I think, start to change their mindset on is performance and team engagement are not two different things. Because, when you're an individual contributor or you're early in your career, you think of performance as a solitary pursuit. It's my goal, my objective, my performance. As you get more and more senior and as you start taking on team leadership, I think you need to realize that a lot of your performance is delivered along with other people. And especially your team. I mean, if you think of a CEO is actually the most useless person in the company. You don't make anything, you don't sell anything. The only way you can drive performance is by enabling others, busting their barriers, giving clear direction. So I think the best thing a new leader can do is not take the added stress of thinking of these as two separate things to pursue, but really center it on what will it take to help my people succeed. You know,
mm.
where do they need capabilities? Where do they need coaching? Where do they need clear direction? How can I bust barriers that come in their way? How do I make them feel like what they're doing is valued? Once you do that, chances are that the results will follow. If all you do is you chase the number and the results and you treat this as something separate, chances are over time the wheel's going to fall off. So that would be my advice to new leaders is, and I remember this happened to me in my career pretty early on. I just got promoted as a brand manager. First ever time in my life I had direct reports. I think 3 direct reports. And I remember we had a big management presentation and they were running short on time. And they said, hey, we'll do it some other time. Everyone had prepared. And, you know, people were obviously, and then when I walked out, we didn't get a chance to present. And I saw these 3 young people just with their shoulders drooping, completely disheartened. And I realized, oh my God, I'm actually responsible for how they feel. It's my job now to, you know, buck them up and make them feel energized. That was, I think, a moment of truth for me, because when you aren't leading people, it's you, your results, how you're feeling. As a leader, I think you get that personal accountability, not just for the results, but for how your people feel. And often it's one leading to the other. So that would be my advice is they aren't 2 separate things. They're actually not just interconnected. It's your people, taking care of them is what usually leads to results.
Lovely. Which means what you're saying is get the young leaders not to worry about these words of pressure, performance, team,
Exactly.
etc. Put all these under the carpet. Just take one thing called think about your people. I think that will
Absolutely.
solve everything, right?
Absolutely.
In
Absolutely.
simple words. Lovely. How true. How true. And what is so interesting is how much of technology we talk about, how much of work from home we talk about. We come back to the same old fact that it's all about human beings. It's all about
It
people.
is. And, you know, whether you're working from home, virtually, face to face, ultimately it's all about connecting with people, understanding people.
Yeah.
Also, you know, there's the softer side of understanding people. Equally, to the side of understanding, do you have the right people to deliver what
True.
you need? You know, do you have people who may have the motivation but don't have the capabilities? Do you have people who may have the capabilities, don't have the motivation? I think
Correct.
that's where a leader needs to dig in and help their people succeed so that the results come.
Absolutely. Beautiful. That was very well answered. So let me take that a little further.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
today we're talking about entrepreneurship. We're talking about entrepreneurial leadership.
Yeah.
Another, and MD has got this fund of putting all jargon words, but in the current context, how should leaders play the role of an entrepreneurial leader and help their teams to have more empowerment? What should they do?
Excellent. No, I think the first thing is what they shouldn't do. I think you know sometimes you know with these buzzwords is they just become fashionable to say. Is very often you'll have leaders saying, "I want to create an entrepreneurial environment." Then when the team member comes up with an idea, ask those 50 other people and go through these processes. So I think you know the first thing is don't just talk about it. It's not a buzzword to throw around. You know, very often you'll see you know people in large companies saying we behave like a startup, and you know what does that mean? The core of running your own business is there's no sense of entitlement, right? You have to earn your success, and then they get mired in all that big company politics of you know why didn't I get this, my budget was this last year. So I think the first is to understand that look, if you want to create that kind of environment, it needs to go beyond buzzwords. And I think there are probably 3 or 4 things leaders can think about if they truly want to create a more empowered environment. I think the first is to be accessible. And you know, I always tell my teams, imagine we're just a bunch of friends who've started a business together. So you take away all the buzzwords. If it's just a bunch of friends, and you know, yeah, we work in a global company, but imagine the global company has invested in us. How would we work with each other, and how would we work with our
Very
stakeholders?
true. Very different.
Because then that just drives a lot of simplicity. You take out all the BS. Of course, there'll be issues and problems in any business, but then you're dealing with them not with the silos of I'm function X, he's function Y. It's like, hey, we're just a bunch of people. We're trying
Yeah.
to build something together. If something goes wrong, we back each other up. Something goes right, we celebrate together. So I think one is that accessibility rather than being that remote leader who's sitting in a corner office waiting to review. Really rolling up your sleeves, leading from the front, helping solve issues, helping participate in creation of solutions. I think that's one part which I think is really important is accessibility. I think the second part, which is really important in creating that kind of environment, is almost reversing the power structure.
Mhm.
Because historically, in a lot of traditional organizations, where does power come from? It comes from the gray hair on your head, the title you have, the size of your
Mhm.
office, the number of years you've worked. I
Mhm.
think if you really want to behave like an entrepreneur, power comes from who is closest to your consumer or customer.
True.
And then how do you tap into that? So you shouldn't have somebody who's just sitting in an office looking at a screen. You should actively need to go out and solicit
Mhm.
ideas from people who are closest to your consumers, who are sometimes the youngest people on the team. Give
Right.
them a seat at the table, seek out their ideas, give them a safe space to express their ideas,
Mhm.
challenge the status quo if needed. Because the worst thing you can do is, the worst words actually a leader can use is, no, that's not how we do things around here. That's it, you're done. Nobody's
Mhm.
ever going to give you a new idea again. And I think just
Right.
creating that environment where people who are younger, are closer to consumers, are able to express ideas, bring in fresh thinking. And the final thing I think that leaders can do is, and this is an always on struggle, I can't say I've licked it yet, though I'd love to do better at it, is take away as much as possible of unnecessary rituals. I
Mhm.
think part of my bugbear with the corporate world is, you want to talk about something, the instinct of many people is, I'll make a slide deck. No, no, can we just talk? I don't need to see
Talk.
50 slides. Just tell me what your idea is, and move away from rituals to insights, ideas, problem solving. And I think part of I think there's a deep seated conspiracy done by people who design PowerPoint, that anything, you'll see a 50 slide deck. And I'm saying, but you don't have to spend your time on all these slides. Just tell me what the problem is. Tell me what your ideas. I think that liberates people, because then people can spend their time on solving problems, thinking of ideas, finding solutions, spending time with customers, rather than endlessly preparing for meetings and going through rituals.
Mm. All this builds so much of formality in an informal environment. That's the best to work, isn't it? Unnecessary.
Oh, absolutely. And I think to be honest, Rajiv, I think to some extent is just people power tripping. I think, people some leaders take so much of the validation out of, I have this big office and, people need to make appointments to meet with me and I'm inaccessible. I don't think what they realize is being accessible actually makes you a more
True.
powerful leader, because
True.
you're then able to have a much more significant leadership impact on a broader part of the organization than being, the leader who's inaccessible, command and control model where you're the voice of God which booms out once in a while. So I think especially for younger people today, I mean, if I think about when we began our careers versus now, at that time it was true. Senior management was physically inaccessible. If you think of what the young people are growing up with today, everyone has the same share of voice. Doesn't matter if you're the president of the US or an 18-year-old college kid, there's 240
True.
characters on Twitter. And I think our technology has, I think, really democratized the world. It's made people much more accessible, given people a platform to share their ideas. And I think leaders need to recognize that that's what young people want. They want to be heard. They want to feel like their ideas are valued, independent of where they are in the hierarchy. And I think that's what leaders need to tap into if they truly want to create a more empowered organization.
Absolutely. Yesterday I was listening to a conversation between Rajiv Malhotra, the
Mhm.
exponent of Hinduism and Eastern world culture to the
Yeah.
Western world, with a 19-year-old boy who is a
Wow.
Stanford student, and how this 19-year-old boy who comes from a Brahmin family in South India had to
Mhm.
follow certain rituals in life, and he wanted a separate dorm or certain facilities. He went on to the Stanford uh, all religious, some officer, and asked him, these are my requirements, can you do it? And Stanford accommodated this. I was wondering,
Wow.
where is Rajiv Malhotra and where is this boy? And they had a conversation at same level, which is what you're
Wow.
talking about.
Wow. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll share that with you on WhatsApp after this
That'll be great. I'd
conversation. A
love to see that.
lovely chat. I mean,
Absolutely.
19-year-old boy, what calm and composure as he was speaking. It didn't look like somebody who's just 19.
Yeah.
I think lovely, lovely. That takes me to the next one, yeah, which is completely off track to what we are saying. But I when I was writing this, I thought this is something very interesting because you gave a very different paradigm. And I want you to articulate this for a lot of
Sure.
leaders here, young leaders, women leaders, men leaders on this platform listening to you. Let me read it straight away. Many leaders work on encouraging diversity. And what you said is very nice. Some women leaders cringe at this phrase, and I've seen some of them really cringing. What should leaders do to build a diverse organization?
Yeah. No, I think the first thing is, when a leader says, we don't have enough diversity in our team, we want to encourage diversity, we want to promote diversity. My first instinct is, my God, how condescending is that? You're not doing anyone any favors. And I think the biggest thing leaders can do to be authentic in driving diversity in their teams is not start with, I have a quota to meet, that we should have a certain number on diversity. It's the simple philosophy of all our organizations should represent the population we serve and the customers and consumers we serve. So if I think of the kind of business we're a consumer products company. Mathematically, half our consumers are women. And if you actually look at shoppers on many of our categories, there's probably more than that. So it's as simple as that. When your organization is more representative of the people you serve, chances are you're going to bring in more ideas, empathy for your consumers. Chances are higher you're not going to have blind spots. I mean, if you think of a room, I'm just to take an extreme example, a room full of middle-aged men discussing what a teenager wants in a sanitary pad. It's like, yeah, there's zero empathy there. There's probably a lot of intellect. There's zero empathy there.
Right.
And it's not that you need to go one extreme or the other. It's just as simple as, look, any organization, any business should represent the people they serve. And I think just starting with that, and I think where many leaders lose the plot is they started, we need a diversity target and we are behind the target. And the whole words of we are encouraging, that is so condescending. You're making up for the fact that you haven't done a good job of building a representative organization. So I think that's the first thing, is being clear and authentic about the case for diversity. It's not about chasing a number. It's not about more women, more men, good, bad. It's just what, hey, let's just be representative of the people we serve. And the second thing I think that becomes really important is for leaders to role model that. If they authentically don't believe in it, it just falls completely. You can make all the statements you want, but then you genuinely need to believe in it. And for me, that's my take on that question.
I think very right point, because I always felt, why would you need a D&I head in an organization? I kind of never understood that concept. And as I had recently finished Indra Nooyi's book, and the way she beautifully talks about when she walked into the boardroom, she was the one lady among men standing there, people are looking at her, and she said all through the career, they never looked at her as a woman. The gender element never came in. They looked at her as a person who's absolutely potential to lead businesses. And she said, that's how I grew. And that's how probably that part of the world where she grew gave her those, canvas and opportunities. But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, that why why do it just for mathematical number? It's not about head count. HR के ऊपर pressure है. Your DNA का number target reach नहीं हो रहा है. And as you rightly said, CEO को एक graph जाता है. Sir, आपके इस साल का number reach नहीं हुआ. अगले साल हम 2 TD लेके आएंगे. What's the point?
Yeah.
You don't believe in it, right? I think very, very powerful. But how have you worked on this in your organization?
Well, I guess, it's not just this organization. In general, I think growing up the way I did, appreciating diversity is just hard-coded in my DNA. So I remember, when I moved to Canada, I was, 9 years old. I was the first kid from India in my class. And I just felt firsthand that, some people welcomed me with open arms, and for others, who's the strange kid from, the Jungle Book. And then we lived there 5 years, and I came back to Delhi. And, when you're teenagers, you know how teenagers can be. And I had studied French for 5 years. I had a bit of an accent. And for some kids, it's like, just another kid. For others, are like, who's this foreign return kid with a funny accent? So I think very early on in life, I realized firsthand that how do you think about whether somebody is different or alike or deserves a seat at the table is all in your head. When you exclude people, it reflects more on you than on anyone else. So for me, I think that's just hardwired in me, is that, I'm completely almost colorblind, blind on any aspect, because it's like I've just realized, look, first understand who the person is, what they bring to the table. It doesn't matter what the color of the skin is, what their religion is, what their gender is. So I think when I approach diversity, it's almost, my starting point is it's almost purist, naive view of life, which says, why are we even having this conversation?
Beauty is this philosophy has gone into you at a tender age, where you're not cluttered by other thoughts as people would when they grow up. So I think beautiful.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, where I need to work on a bit is I get impatient, because the reality is not everybody thinks that way. And this, can we really have a woman candidate for this role? Why? I mean, women have led countries, women are playing fighter planes. What are we talking about here? Somebody sitting in front of a laptop or going and doing sales. I mean, come on, let's get real. So I think, at times I realize that, and I think that's where, uh, when you're driving change, you have to, I think, be self-aware of where you are. You equally need to be aware of where people are. And I think part of my journey has been, how do you take people along? Because you're never going to drive change by, beating someone on the head saying you're wrong, because nobody's right or wrong. Everybody has their views based on their own experiences, based on what they have seen. So for me, the starting point is when I encounter differences or resistance to change, my first instinct is, okay, let me understand, why do you feel this way?
Yeah.
And I know I share my story. This is why I feel this way. This is what I have seen. Tell me your experiences. And I think once you relate to people at that level, a lot of those intellectual things go down,
Very
because
true.
then people start understanding why they might feel a certain way. They might be more open-minded to change.
Mm.
So that's kind of how I approach these conversations
Very
typically.
well. As you spoke about change, that leads us to the next segment, which is
Sure.
leading through change, right? So one of the toughest tests for a leader is to embrace change and drive change.
Yeah.
Change has been a word for donkey years, and people kind of usko hawa bana ke rakha, lofted it and just somewhere in there. Transformational change, such a lofty word.
Yeah.
What is the simple advice that you can give to leaders who want to drive transformational change without getting into jargons and
Sure. Sure. No,
puffy
I think
words?
the toughest part of driving any change is changing yourself.
Hmm.
Because it's easy to change a process, it's easy to change an organization structure. You can sit in a slide and say, okay, this person moves here, this person moves there. It's easy to change business models on paper. The toughest thing to change is how people think. And even within that, the real torture test is changing how you think. The reality is we're all human beings. We are all conditioned to work a certain way. We all have our blind spots. We all have our inertia. So when
Hmm.
I typically am, faced with an assignment or a role where there's a lot of change to be driven,
Hmm.
one of the first things I do is sit down and say, what do I need to unlearn?
Hmm.
What do I need to learn? What do I need to relearn? Because
Hmm.
so that it's not that I know everything, but at least I am going in knowing what I don't know. So for
Right.
example, when I came into my most recent assignment, it's been now almost 18 months at Kimberly-Clark. Even before I joined, I just kind of put down 3 columns saying, here's stuff I would love to learn more about. Here is stuff which I know I don't know, which
Hmm.
I think to be successful, I'm going to need to learn. And here are things which I have beliefs on, but
Hmm.
I'm going to put them out there so that they don't become subconscious biases. I'm putting them out there that those beliefs are not random, they're based on my experiences, but I am willing to test them. I'm
Hmm.
willing to almost do it as hypothesis testing rather than taking them as an article of faith. And I think the biggest barrier to transformation becomes when organizations and leaders have blind spots because they've done things a certain way and they assume that will work. Second is choices made, which may have been right at a certain point in time,
Hmm.
almost become articles of faith and don't get questioned. And I
Right.
think real transformation happens when you're comfortable talking about those, when you're comfortable questioning those,
Hmm.
without saying it was bad, without saying somebody screwed up. It may have made sense in that context at a past time. Maybe the world around us has changed, but a lot of that to happen, it needs to start in your own mind. And I
Hmm.
think for any leader, I think the biggest prerequisite of any change management is self-awareness, is really sitting down thinking. If you have a good mentor, have a chat with a mentor or a colleague,
Hmm.
so who you can use as a sounding board, so that you are clear about, are you potentially carrying any blind spots? Do you have any things you're taking as articles of faith which you should question, or
Hmm.
you're taking as constraints which need not be constraints?
True.
And I think that's kind of my advice for anybody who's trying to bring about any change in their organization or business.
Very, very rightly said. It's all about thinking and making it simple in your own head, unnecessarily making it complicated in there. You get this word
Absolutely.
called transformation, and then I'm going back to my theories. I'm going back to my all those earlier work and making it even more complicated, which is already being projected as pretty complicated stuff. I think it's
Absolutely.
it's very, very simple, as you rightly said. Thank you so much. I think this makes a lot of sense to the young leaders all the more, Mainak, because I work with a lot of these guys also, they have a tendency to overcomplicate things unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And I'm not making a judgmental statement here, but sometimes because of whatever qualification they come from or the aggression to do things and prove, etc., it seems to be making themselves complicated and burdening themselves. जो जरूरत नहीं है.
That's true.
Yeah, very true. Very, very true. Just making me think. That takes me to the next question. Okay. Change agent. Connected to the earlier question.
Yeah.
Everybody talks about this today, change
Yeah.
agent. Interview me, tell me how will you change? What's the change agent side of yours? What have you done in the past? Boring, used and abused question. What does it exactly mean being a change agent? Tell us in the simplest words.
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I'll say is what it doesn't mean. And for a lot of people, a word like change agent is another one of those corporate words which is so misused, like out of the box. It's like people just throw stuff
Catalyst.
out there. Catalyst, change maker, all of this is nonsense. But the thing is, people put it out there, and the biggest mistake they make is they think something like being a change agent is about how you show up. Someone hustles, someone's aggressive. Maybe that works at times, maybe that works for you. But for me, the core of it actually comes down to three mindsets. One is genuine open-minded curiosity. To drive any change, you have to be insanely curious. You cannot stop at the superficial level of, okay, this is how stuff works. You need to ask why. Why can't it work differently? Who else might be doing it differently? The only way you're going to drive change in anything is to develop the ability to understand that there might be many ways of doing things. Be curious about how things happen. Be curious about how things might happen differently. And I think what sometimes in our educational system, honestly, sometimes comes in the way is we make people converge too quickly on the one correct answer. Running a business is not an analytical solution. It's not an algorithm where you say, I've got it, this is the answer. Sometimes you need to diverge, you need to look at things in multiple ways and then pull back and say, hey, what makes sense for us? I think the ability to do that requires curiosity, which I think is critical. I think the second thing is just continuous learning. The day you say, I am an expert, I know it all, you're dead. You are then part of the status quo, you're on your way to being the next dodo. You have to continually say, look, what's happening in the world around me? What's happening in my industry? What's happening with people? Whatever field you're in, how do you continually learn? How do you have that hunger to learn so that you're not getting static and becoming part of the status quo? Because only then will you ever question the status quo. Yeah? That when you become part, fat and happy and part of the status quo, you're never really going to question it. And the final thing I think you need is really courage of conviction, that to drive any change. Reality is you will face resistance, you will fail at times, things won't work out. Sometimes, guess what? You'll just have to change your mind because you may do something and you realize, hey, this wasn't the right solution. So I think you just need to be able to hang in there, go through that roller coaster, embrace that volatility. I think if you can do those three things, then you probably have a good shot at driving meaningful change. Now, whether being called a change agent strokes your ego or not, be my guess. But whether with or without that tag, I think to drive change, you probably need those three characteristics.
Lovely, lovely. Guys, all the young leaders here who are listening to Mainak, in your own journey, I think it's a great 3-pointer. You should write it down on your whiteboard. I've got a whiteboard here. Curiosity, continuous learning, and courage. I think can make any one of us a transformational change agent. I think that's a prerequisite. Thanks, Mainak. That was very beautifully articulated. I think it's very, very tremendous value what you're saying. You don't have to get bogged down by that huge word. It's as simple as learning, courage, curiosity. That's it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Beautiful. I just love the way you articulated that. I'm going to go to the next one, which is very interesting, which is part of leading yourself.
Okay.
We spoke about others, we spoke about change, let's talk about self now. This risk taking and being cautious. Keep jumping between these two. And I was in that stage when I took the entrepreneurial plunge. I came and asked my dad, I'm going to do this. I said, good father, first question, कितने महीने का राशन पानी है? I said, 24 महीने के ऊपर तो चला लूंगा. Good job. So, how should young leaders get out of this conflict?
Yeah, see, I guess it's very difficult to give one answer for everyone because the reality is Everyone thinks differently about life. Everyone's situation in life is different. So, I'd be very flippant if I said, yeah, everybody should take risks. Maybe people can't take risks. Maybe their family situation requires them not to take big risks in their careers and lives. And I respect that completely. The one thing I do believe in, however, is no matter where we are, what life stage we're in, what age we are, I think it's always important to keep thinking of how do you aim slightly ahead of where you are today.
Mm.
And that need not be in terms of material progress necessarily.
Mm.
Because I think the core of success in anything is a healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I think what I would advise everyone is it's not good to be comfortable. Because if you're too comfortable, chances are you aren't learning, chances are you aren't growing, chances aren't you are not picking up skills that are going to help you in the future. So
Sure.
I think it's always good to be in a state where you're happy with what you're doing, be fulfilled with what you're doing, but always to some extent think of this, I'd like to be a bit better in this, or I'd like to learn more about this, or I'd like to push myself a bit on this. Now, different people's situations may be different. For some people, that might manifest into a big leap where you're taking a big risk, you're shifting sectors, becoming an entrepreneur, doing radically different things. For other people, it may be as simple as let me pick up a new skill, which I think is going to make me more future ready. Let me pick up a new aspect of my business, which I didn't know about earlier. Let me just pick up a hobby I'm passionate about. Let me get involved in my community in a way I haven't been before. Whatever it is, I think it's always important for people to not bracket themselves in this comfortable cocoon of I have a job, I'm happy with what I'm doing, I'm self-actualized. I think that's the barrier to progress. And I think that's true for people as well as nations. I think nations progress when they're always aspiring for something more. If you say we're self-actualized, we're happy, you're never going to have innovation, you're never going to have growth, you're never going to encourage people to find new ways of doing things. So for me, that healthy dissatisfaction is always good. How far you take it, I'm no one to tell people that everyone should do X or Y. Everyone needs to decide based on their circumstances how far they stretch.
Could you take a minute to expand this point that you said? And lovely, these two words that you coined together is very only an author can do that. I could never do that. Healthy dissatisfaction. That's I never
Yeah.
got these words
Yeah.
together. What does it mean? What does
Yeah. See,
healthy dissatisfaction, unhealthy dissatisfaction?
Yeah. See, an unhealthy dissatisfaction means you fundamentally are questioning your self-worth. You are feeling like you are trapped. You're feeling like,
Feeling a victim?
yeah, you're feeling like a victim. You're feeling like you're not valued. That's unhealthy dissatisfaction with the status quo, because that's pathetic. If you feel that, you should just
I
leave
go
and
through a guilt
do
trip.
something completely different, right? A healthy dissatisfaction with the status quo means fundamentally I'm happy, but there are more things I'd like to do to create a better future. I'd like to learn something new or to develop myself. I think that's a healthy dissatisfaction where you're building that dissatisfaction not with removing a negative, but building on positives. So, an example might be, look, somebody says, I'm really happy with what I'm doing. I'm really happy in the company I'm in. I'd like to learn more about another function. Maybe I'll go do an assignment there, which takes me outside my comfort zone, but I learned something very different. That's building off positives that you like the place you're in. Versus a negative, oh, I hate this place, my boss hates me, I don't want to come to office. That's unhealthy.
Change my team, change my role.
that's unhealthy. So I think a healthy dissatisfaction is where you're feeding the positives and taking them to the next level or building them in new directions, versus just being comfortable and closing yourself to growth, closing yourself to stretching yourself, closing yourself to learning more.
Lovely, Manak. Thank you for giving me this phrase, because been multiple occasions where people have asked me on forum that how was it when you took the entrepreneurial plunge, and I had answers. But now I have a very clear answer that I think healthy dissatisfaction has had triggered me. I'm able to think now. When I go back on the decision that kept me awake for many nights, and I said, okay, I am going to do this now. I think there was something that was searching inside me, that healthy dissatisfaction, wanting something healthier.
Yeah, and
It
I
will satisfy
imagine,
me more.
yeah, and see, a lot of this, Rajiv, we're all smarter with the benefit of hindsight. But if I look at many of the choices I made in my life, if I think about the choice you made, it wasn't because you hated your life. It's because you loved doing some things and you wanted to take that to the next level.
True.
Right.
True.
And you thought that would add value to your life. And that for me is a great example of a healthy dissatisfaction, where you're making a change, not to get away from unpleasant things or because you hate yourself, but because you want to devote time to something you really love and build something out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so right. I'm suddenly thinking, as you're speaking, that if it was unhealthy dissatisfaction that is triggering that thing, then it would be an escapist mentality.
Exactly. Exactly. And very often, and I would say, even if you feel trapped, and see, it's all happened to everybody. It's going to happen to everybody at some point in their life, is you're stuck in a situation where you're really uncomfortable. Maybe your boss doesn't like you. Maybe you're not a good fit with the company you're in. Maybe you're not a good fit with the people you're around. Even in those situations, I think it's best to sit back and say, what actually feeds the positivity in me? What do I enjoy doing? Because otherwise, if you're just doing it purely to escape, chances are you're just taking something which is not what you have. Not that it's something that's necessarily a better fit for you, something that's actually going to set you up for more success or fulfillment. So I think even in those situations, it's always good to take a step back and say, fine, I know I'm not happy where I am, but what would make me happy? What kind of environment, what kind of people, what kind of work, and then seek something out, rather than success is it's not my current status quo, which is a pretty low bar to set.
Lovely. Guys, I'm going to put this, and I'm tempted to do this. All of you is looking at the next stage in your career. You want to do something else. Take a chart paper, put a vertical line, write healthy dissatisfaction here, write unhealthy dissatisfaction here. Start putting point and see which column is longer, and which column is longer should be on the healthy dissatisfaction side. If that is driving your decision, you're on the right track. If this side is longer, you may want to sit back and ponder it. That's a great point, Mainak. Right? It's such a lovely conversation. I'm going to end this with the last question. With
Sure.
all the years of experience that you've garnered and books that you've written, two bullseye advice to the young listeners.
I guess the first advice would be never start believing in your own myth. Always be humble, always be a student. I think what happens too early is people start thinking they've, quote unquote, arrived. And I think that's, a very slippery slope. I think no matter where you are, if you're fresh out of college, if you're 5 years in the job, 10 years in the job, if you're the CEO of a company, it doesn't matter. I think it's always good to think of yourself as a student. There's always a lot to learn. There are always things you don't know. There are always things you can be better at. So I think that humility and learning is something which I think is an important mindset to have. The second thing that I'd share with anybody is ultimately, it's all about people. No matter what field of endeavor you're in, no matter whether you're running your own business or you're working in a corporation, ultimately, it's about people. It's about serving people, your customers and consumers. It's about growing people who could be your employees. It's about working with people who could be your colleagues. So I think just empathy, understanding people, understanding how you can help and serve people is something which is important. If I think of, my own experience, if I think of the 2 years I was in my MBA school, if I had to go back again and rewind the clock, I would pay much more attention to that. Because I remember, 27 years ago when I joined my MBA school, a lot of the focus was on solving business issues, numbers, analysis. And if I fast forward now, I realize that any of those solutions ultimately comes down to people. Do you have the right people on the job? Are they motivated? Are they seeing it the right way? Are people working together? Do you understand your customers and consumers well? And so if I could rewind and do one thing better with my time when I was on campus, it'd be spend more time on people, understand my group members, understand team dynamics, go beyond the numbers and the case studies to think about the people behind the numbers. So, that's the advice. Those are the two pieces of advice I'd give.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so well said. It was a lovely conversation, Mainak, and I completely enjoyed this chat. This was informal. This was just breezy. You didn't make it Q&A. It was very conversational. So thank you so much for coming and doing this for us.
No, thanks. It was wonderful being here. I hope your listeners found some of what we said helpful, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. Wish you all the best too. And looking forward to meeting you in person sometime soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.